The night Nora finally played the piano, I was in the workshop sanding the legs of a walnut dining table that had already taken me 3 weeks longer than it should have. The window above my bench was propped open the way I kept it all through October, even when the mountain air came in cold enough to fog my breath. I had my headphones around my neck but not in my ears, which was unusual for me. I almost always worked with music, something steady and wordless that matched the rhythm of whatever my hands were doing. But that night I had left them off for no reason I could name, and that small, aimless choice turned out to matter more than anything I had planned that entire week. The first note came through the open window like it had been waiting a long time to be let out. I set down the sandpaper. I didn't move. I wasn't even sure at first that I hadn't imagined it. The house had been quiet for so long, years before Nora arrived, and 3 full weeks after, that the sound of a single note from the old upright piano in the living room felt almost wrong, the way it feels to hear a voice in a room you were certain was empty. Then she kept playing. It wasn't a full piece, not at first. It was slow and tentative, like she was asking the keys a question and waiting to hear if they still remembered the answer. A few measures, a pause, the same phrase again, slightly bolder. Then it opened up into something I didn't recognize but felt immediately, the way you feel the temperature change before a storm. I stood at the bench with sawdust on my forearms and the smell of walnut oil heavy in the air, and I did not breathe for a long time. I just listened to Nora Ellis play a piano she had told me she didn't touch anymore, and I felt something shift inside the house the way a room shifts when someone finally opens a window that has been shut for years. I didn't go inside. I didn't want her to stop, but let me take you back to the beginning, because the music was not where this story started. It started on a Wednesday morning in late September when my phone rang and my old friend Danny's sister Claire called to ask if I still had the spare room above the workshop, and whether I'd be willing to let a friend of hers stay for a while. Claire and I had gone to school together. She was honest and I trusted her, which is why I didn't ask too many questions. She said her friend needed to get out of a situation in Billings. She said she was quiet and wouldn't be any trouble. She said she was good with numbers and spreadsheets if that meant anything to me. I told her I had been running my furniture orders out of a handwritten ledger for 2 solid years and that yes, that meant quite a lot. She said her friend would arrive Friday. I said fine and hung up and went back to the walnut table that was already 2 weeks behind schedule. Nora showed up the following afternoon in a 10-year-old Honda with a cracked front bumper and the careful, contained energy of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. She had 2 bags and a cardboard box that she carried herself without asking for help, even though I was standing 3 feet away with perfectly good hands. When I came out to meet her, she said hello, told me her name, and then immediately said she was sorry for the short notice and that she'd stay out of my way and that she didn't eat much and that she could pay the first month up front if that made things simpler. I told her to come inside and have coffee first. She looked at me like that was an unexpectedly strange thing to say. The room above the workshop wasn't much. A bed, a dresser, a small window that looked east over the Pine Ridge, and a bathroom just big enough to turn around in without knocking your elbows. But it was warm and it was clean and it was hers alone, which I got the feeling was not something she had been able to say about a space in a long time. She set her bags down carefully and stood in the middle of the room as though she wasn't sure she had permission to move around in it. I told her the door locked from the inside and the key was hers to keep. I told her if she wanted to help with the business books, I'd knock 20% off the rent and call it even. She said that was fair. She said she appreciated it. She said she hoped she wouldn't be too much trouble. I had already started to notice that she apologized for things that hadn't happened yet. The first week was mostly silence and careful small exchanges. I worked in the shop from early morning until the light went, and Nora spent most of the day at the kitchen table with my folders of receipts and invoices spread around her laptop. By Thursday, she had built a system I couldn't have imagined on my own. A spreadsheet that tracked materials, labor hours, delivery windows, and client deposits with a color logic that actually made sense. She left it open on the screen and put a sticky note beside it explaining the columns without being asked. I stood at the counter reading her note for a long time. Her handwriting was very small and very precise, and she had drawn a tiny arrow in the margin pointing to a column I might have overlooked. I thought about how much care a person has to have been trained out of to write instructions that meticulously, just so someone else wouldn't feel lost in a system she had built entirely on her own. The second week, I noticed she had added a second color to the spreadsheet, a pale green for orders that were running ahead of schedule. No one asked her to. She just thought it would help and did it. Small acts of care, done quietly, without any of the performance that usually surrounds generosity. I thought about that a lot in the evenings, about what kind of person gives like that, silently, without waiting for acknowledgement. One night, toward the end of that second week, I came in late from the workshop and found her still at the kitchen table, a cup of cold tea at her elbow, her laptop open to a page of handwritten sheet music she had photographed and was trying to transcribe digitally. She had her lower lip caught between her teeth the way she did when she was concentrating and didn't know anyone was watching. I stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard me. I asked what she was working on. She closed the laptop quickly, not hiding it exactly but reflexively, the way someone covers something they've been told isn't worth looking at. She said it was nothing, just something old. I said it didn't look like nothing. She said it was a piece she had written years ago for a student recital and she had been trying to remember how it ended. I asked if she wanted more light. She looked at me for a second and then opened the laptop again. I pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her and didn't say anything else. And she went back to work and neither of us talked for almost an hour. And it was the most comfortable I had felt in a shared room in longer than I could honestly say. The old upright piano sat against the living room wall the way it had since my mother left it there when I was 12 and she went to stay with her sister in Bozeman and never quite came back. It was tuned every other year out of habit, and I had played it badly until I was about 15 and then stopped entirely. It lived in the corner like a piece of furniture that had once been important, under a layer of dust and a folded quilt my grandmother had made. When Nora first walked through the living room the day she arrived, she stopped at it for a moment. Just a half-second pause in her step. She didn't touch it. She didn't say anything. She kept walking. But I noticed. I noticed the way she always took the long route around the living room when she passed through afterward. The way a person gives wide berth to something they're not sure they're allowed to want anymore. 3 weeks in, we had fallen into a kind of rhythm that neither of us had named or discussed. Morning coffee was somehow shared without being arranged. She started making a full pot, and I started being inside by 7. Lunch was separate. Dinner was occasional. Neither of us making plans, but both somehow ending up in the kitchen at the same time more nights than not. She cooked quietly and well. She never asked me what I liked, but she watched what I ate, and over time the things that ended up in the pan were always things I would have chosen myself, though I couldn't work out when or how she had learned that without asking. It was the kind of attention that most people never think to give. The kind that doesn't announce itself or ask for a receipt. One evening I asked if she had been a cook before. She said no. She had been a music teacher. I asked if she missed it. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the pan. Then she said, "I missed it before I stopped." By the time I stopped, I had already been told enough times that I didn't really love music, that I was only good at the technical parts, that real feeling wasn't something I could access. She paused. He said I played correctly, but that I played like someone who didn't feel anything. He said that was my problem in general, that I did everything right but without any real depth, that was the word he used, hollow. She said the word flatly. The way you say a word you've repeated to yourself so many times it has worn smooth and lost its ability to surprise you. And that flatness was worse than anger would have been. Anger would have meant she was still fighting it. That flatness meant she had accepted it somewhere along the way you accept a scar, not because it was ever true, but because it had been pressed into you long enough that it started to feel like part of your shape. I turned back to the dish I was washing and didn't answer right away because I had learned a long time ago that some things need space before a response. Jumping in too fast makes a person feel handled rather than heard. Then I said, "That's a strange thing to tell someone who spent years teaching other people how to feel music." She looked at me. She didn't answer, but something moved across her face, something careful and uncertain, like a door that was not yet ready to open but had just remembered it had a handle. That was the night I went out to the workshop after dinner and found the broken music stand in the corner where it had been sitting since I bought it at an estate sale 3 years ago and never got around to fixing. The hinge mechanism was bent and the height collar had cracked, and it leaned against the wall at an angle that made it look tired. I spent an hour sourcing the right replacement part online and ordered it without thinking too hard about why. I told myself it was because clutter bothered me. I had gotten good at lying to myself by that point in my life. The part arrived 4 days later. I fixed it on a Saturday morning while Nora was at the library in town. I set it in the corner near the piano without saying a word about it. She noticed that evening when she came in from the cold with her coat still buttoned and her nose red at the tip. She stopped in the doorway and looked at it. Then she looked at me. I kept reading. She didn't say thank you right away. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and when she finally moved into the room she walked the short way, not the long way around. And then one Tuesday night in late October, I was in the workshop and I heard the piano. After I listened long enough to understand she had truly settled into it. The music coming through the window in long, unhurried waves now, something with the texture of water moving over rocks, slow and purposeful and sure of itself. I put my tools down and sat on the old wooden stool by the bench and did not go inside until it stopped. Not because I was afraid of interrupting her, because I understood without being told that this was the first time in a long time that Nora Ellis had let herself be heard, and some moments are too important to witness directly. I stayed in the workshop until the last note faded and the house went quiet again. Then I sat there a little longer just to be certain. When I came in through the back door, she was at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug, looking at the grain of the wood. I hung up my jacket. She said, "I heard you come in." I said, "I heard you play." She looked up at me, and her eyes had that particular brightness that comes just before or just after something that matters. She asked if it had bothered me. I told her it was the best thing that had happened in this house in years. She looked back at the table, she pressed her lips together, and then she did something I hadn't seen her do once in the 5 weeks she had been here. She smiled. Not the small, apologetic almost smile she offered when she wanted to seem agreeable. A real one. Brief and private, as if she had surprised herself with it and wasn't sure yet what to do about that. I didn't make anything of it. I asked if she wanted more coffee. She said yes. The next 2 weeks were different in the quiet way October feels different from September even when nothing visible has changed. There was a new temperature to our days. She played in the evenings now with a growing certainty that was something to hear in someone who had been told for years that certainty was not available to her. Some nights I sat in the living room and listened with a book open in my lap that I stopped reading within the first few pages. Some nights I stayed in the workshop and let the music come through the open window into the cold air around me. Either way, it moved through the house the way warmth moves through old wood. Slowly, thoroughly, into all the places that had been cold the longest. I started leaving the workshop window open later into the night than the cold really warranted. Then Marcus called. I was in the driveway loading a finished bookcase into the truck when I heard her voice change through the kitchen window. She had been humming. She did that sometimes now, quietly, while she worked at the table, and then she answered her phone and the humming stopped and her voice went flat and careful in the exact way it had been on the day she arrived, before the rhythm of the house had started to bring her back to herself. I didn't hear what she said. I heard the tone. When I came inside, she was standing at the sink with the phone face down on the counter, looking out at the pine ridge. Her shoulders were up near her ears. I asked if everything was all right. She said yes. I waited. She said that was Marcus, my ex. She said ex with the same careful flatness she'd used for hollow, like a tooth that had been pulled and the socket hadn't fully healed over. He says he's going to be passing through. He wants to see me. He says he wants to explain some things. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. He always wants to explain things. I asked what she was going to do. She turned from the window and looked at me carefully. I told him I'd think about it. She watched my face. You think I shouldn't. I think it's your choice. But you think I shouldn't. I set my keys on the counter and chose my words the way I always had to. I think that when someone has spent a long time convincing you that you're not capable of something, hearing their explanation for why they did it rarely changes the fact that you've already spent years believing them. Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He's very persuasive." And I said, "I know. That's what worries me." She didn't tell him not to come. I found that out 9 days later when a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled into the gravel drive on a Thursday afternoon. I was at the workbench and I saw it through the window. I watched the man who stepped out. Tall, the kind of lean that looks deliberate. A jacket that probably cost more than 2 of my chairs. He had the easy, entitled posture of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in whatever room he entered. He scanned the property the way people do when they are looking for something to disapprove of. Nora met him at the door. I watched their body language from the workshop window. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, not closed off exactly, but armored, the way she had stood on the very first day she arrived, before this house had become a place where she could breathe without apologizing first. He leaned toward her, and she did not lean back, but she also did not step away, and that small failure of distance was what made me set down my chisel and walk out into the yard. I didn't approach them right away. I went to the truck and made a business of checking a load I had already secured twice. But I was in the yard, and Marcus saw me. His eyes moved over me the way they had moved over the property, measuring, categorizing, setting aside. He said something to Nora, then walked over and introduced himself with the smooth, practiced handshake of someone who uses handshakes as instruments. He said he'd heard she was staying here. He said it pleasantly, in the way that has no pleasant meaning underneath. He said the property was lovely in a tone that suggested he thought nothing of the kind. I said thank you. He said Nora had told him I'd been very helpful. I said she had been helpful to me as well. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that makes the next words feel like a favor. I only came by because I was worried about her, he said. He said it to me, but the words were aimed entirely at her, the way certain people speak, appearing to address one person while performing for another. Nora has a tendency to disappear into situations that feel safe without asking whether they actually are. I just want to make sure she's being looked after properly. I said she was doing a good job of looking after herself. He laughed like that was charming and incorrect. His voice shifted lower then, more intimate, the register of someone who has spent years learning exactly where the soft places are. Nora, he said, not looking at me anymore. You know you don't have to prove anything here. Whatever you're trying to show yourself, you can come back. We can actually work through the things I wasn't good at explaining the first time. Nora had gone very still. I had watched her become unstill over 7 weeks. I had watched her start to take up the space a person is owed in a house they live in, leaving her coffee cup on the counter without washing it immediately, sitting on the porch without checking whether she was allowed, walking through the living room the short way. I had watched her go from apologizing for things that hadn't happened yet to simply existing in a room without running commentary on whether she deserved to be there. And now she had gone still again, in the particular way that a person goes still when something that used to have power over them is being tested for current voltage. He kept going. He said she had never given them a real chance. He said she had always held back. He said the problem in their relationship had been her refusal to open up, her inability to meet him halfway emotionally. He said he had learned things about himself since then. He understood he had been too demanding, but that her part in it, her coldness, her emotional unavailability, that was something she needed to reckon with honestly. He said it all in the measured, reasonable voice of someone who has rehearsed being the misunderstood good person many times and learned which words land without leaving marks. I watched Nora's face through all of it. I watched 7 weeks of careful, quiet reconstruction happening behind her eyes while his words worked at the edges of it, testing the seams, looking for the ones that might still give. I said his name. He stopped. He turned and looked at me. I said, "I think you've said what you came to say." His eyes went cold in a way his smile didn't follow. I wasn't finished. I said, "I know, but she's heard enough." He looked at Nora. "Is that what you want?" someone else deciding when you've heard enough. And Nora, and this was the moment I understood what 7 weeks of quiet mornings and piano music and coffee at 7 in the morning had actually been building toward. Nora looked at him steadily and said, "You spent 3 years telling me I didn't know what I felt. I think I can trust my own reading of this one." The silence that followed that sentence did not need anything added to it. Marcus left the way men like him leave, without acknowledging that anything has ended, maintaining the posture of someone whose exit is also an open invitation to return. He said he'd be in touch. He said he hoped she'd think carefully. He got in the black car and drove out, and the sound of his tires on the gravel was the best sound I had heard all day. Nora stood in the yard after he was gone. The light was doing what October light does in the late afternoon, coming in low and sideways and turning the grass the color of old copper. She had her arms around herself, but it was different from before. Not armor, more like someone who has just run a long distance and is still learning how to stand still. I stood a few feet away and said nothing for a while. The pines at the ridge had gone very dark. A hawk moved silently across the open sky above the tree line and was gone. She watched it go. I watched her. There was something I wanted to say, and I was working out how to say it with the right amount of weight and the right amount of honesty, the way I always had to work things out before I said them. Some people have words the way they have breath, automatic, plentiful, never something to ration. I have never been that way. Every sentence I was ever proud of cost me something to build. She spoke first. "I know what you're going to say." "You don't," I told her honestly. "I don't know what I'm going to say yet either." She let out a shaky breath. She turned to look at me, and I saw in her eyes the whole complicated weight of what she had been carrying since long before she arrived in a cracked bumper Honda. The accumulated damage of being told, slowly and carefully and over years, that the way she loved was not enough, that the language her heart spoke was not a real language, that the silence between her words was emptiness rather than depth. She said very quietly, "What if he was right? Not about everything, but about the important part. What if I actually can't love someone the way they deserve to be loved?" I was quiet for one long moment. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I needed to say it right. "When I was a kid," I said, "I had a stutter. Not a small one. Bad enough that by the time I was 10 I had mostly stopped talking in class, stopped raising my hand, stopped trying to say anything that felt important, because by the time I got it out, the moment was already gone. There was a teacher in 7th grade who told my mother I had a problem communicating, that I struggled to express myself, that I would probably always find close relationships difficult. I paused. He wasn't wrong about the stutter, but he was completely wrong about what it meant. Nora was watching me with her full attention. "He meant it as a deficit," I said. What it actually was that I had learned to mean every single word. Because every word cost me something to get out, I never wasted any of them. I learned to say the exact right thing instead of the easy thing. I learned to show up rather than explain. I learned that the way you sometimes say "I'm here" is by being here, and not by saying it at all. I looked at her steadily. "Marcus told you your way of loving is hollow. I've watched you for 7 weeks. I've watched you learn every single thing I like without asking, because asking felt like too much of a risk. I've watched you rebuild my books with more care than I have ever given them myself. I've watched you fix a spreadsheet and color-code a column you didn't have to add. I've watched you make a broken music stand mean something. I've watched you play a piano that you had been convinced you had no right to touch, and I have heard what that sounds like from the other side of a workshop window with the cold coming in. And there is nothing hollow in the world that makes a sound like that." She was crying now. Not loudly. Nora did not do things loudly. Just quiet tears moving down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. "You don't love the way he wanted to be loved," I said. "That is not the same as being unable to love. That is just a different language. And if you're asking me what I think," I held her eyes, "I'm asking you to teach me how you can. Whatever your language is, however long it takes, I will learn every word of it." She looked at me for a long time without speaking. The last light was almost gone. Just a thin band of amber above the ridgeline, and her face was half in shadow and half in that warm glow. And she was the most real person I had ever stood this close to in my life. She said, "It might be a difficult language." I said, "Good thing I've always been patient." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she walked the 2 steps between us and pressed her face against my shoulder, and I put my arms around her the way I had been careful not to for 7 weeks, and we stood there in the cooling yard while the last of the light disappeared behind the pines and the first stars came through the dark. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. That was something she had already taught me, that there are moments too full for words, and knowing the difference between those moments and the ones that need words is its own kind of fluency. She played every evening after that. Not carefully, not tentatively. She played like someone who had finally been given back a room she had been locked out of for years and was relearning all its corners. The music moved through the house the way warmth moves through old wood, slowly, thoroughly, into all the places that had been cold the longest. Some nights I sat in the living room and let it fill the space around me. Some nights I stayed in the workshop with the window open. Either way, I learned to hear the difference between the pieces she was working through and the ones she had already made peace with. I learned what her pauses meant, and what her tempo meant when it changed, and what it meant when she played something twice in a row without stopping. A language, just like she had said. Specific and alive once you knew how to listen. We did not rush anything. That was the right way for us, and we both understood it without discussion. We had both seen what damage looks like when people move faster than their own repair allows. We went slowly and with full attention, the way you work a good piece of wood. You don't force it, you follow the grain. You let the thing become what it already wants to be. There were evenings I would look across the kitchen table and catch her looking back, and we would both look away at the same time, and there was no awkwardness in it, just the particular warmth of 2 people who have figured out that they have time and are not afraid of it. That was new for both of us. I had spent years treating time like something that was running out. She had spent years being told that what she wasn't enough. Somewhere in the space between those 2 old habits, we found something that felt entirely different. Something that felt like it was meant to stay. By December, her name was on the business account as co-manager. By January, she had 3 piano students driving up the mountain road to the house twice a week, and she came back from teaching with color in her face and a brightness in her voice she was still learning to trust herself with. By spring, the Honda had a new bumper, paid for from her share of the business she had rebuilt from a box of handwritten receipts into something that actually ran. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. I noticed the day it stopped, the way you notice when a sound you have grown used to finally goes quiet, not with relief exactly, but with a kind of fullness, like a question that had been sitting open for a long time had finally settled into its answer. One evening in April, she was playing something I recognized for the first time. A piece she had written herself over the winter, working it out in the late hours after I went to sleep, coming back to it night after night the way I come back to a piece of furniture that isn't finished yet. I stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. She knew I was there. She played it anyway. That was the language. That was the whole of it. She knew I was listening, and she played, and she didn't stop, and she was not hollow, and she had never been hollow, and I had the extraordinary luck of being the person who got to be in the room when she finally, completely started to believe that too. When she finished, she sat for a moment with her hands still resting on the keys. Then she turned and looked at me, and she smiled. Not the small apologetic one, not the brief private one I had first seen in October. A full one. Unhurried, warm, the smile of someone who has stopped measuring whether it is safe to give. "Did you understand it?" she asked. I said, "Every word." 7 months after the first night I heard her play, there was a woman in my house who cooked without being asked, and ran the books with color-coded precision and played the piano like she had always been allowed to. There was a workshop finally running on schedule, and a mountain coming out of winter, and a Honda that wasn't cracked anymore, and a music stand in the corner of the living room that I had fixed one Saturday morning without quite knowing why. I know why now. I had been learning the language before I knew there was a language to learn. Some things in life work that way. The heart figures it out before the head does, and sometimes the hands know before either of them. She asked me once, months later, if I had ever been afraid that she couldn't love me the way I deserved. I told her the honest truth. I said, "You have never once done anything that was less than exactly enough. The only problem was that nobody had ever told you that the thing you were doing was love." She taught me the rest, just like she said she would, just like I always knew she could. And I learned every single word.